brief description of the workshop, addiction and recovery are at their core about the meaning of life. Peg O'Connor will discuss addiction and recovery from a Western philosophical perspective, offering a powerful set of tools sharpened over millennia. She will introduce some of the core concepts and vexing questions of philosophy to help addicts and those affected by their addiction examine and perhaps transform the meaning they make of their lives. Without assuming any familiarity with philosophy, Peg will illuminate issues many addicts and their loved ones face: self-identity, moral responsibility, self-knowledge and self-deception, free will and determinism, fatalism and the nature of God, and their relations to others. And Peg, it's so great to have you with us. This is Peg's second visit. The last time was to talk to us about her wonderful book, which had just recently been released at the time, called Higher and Friendly Powers. And that's a great read. It's all about the philosophy of William James and its effect on Bill Wilson and the foundation of AA. So over to you, Peg. Thank you so much for joining us again. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much to Patrick for inviting me again. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with people around the world and talking about the one thing that we have in common, which is addiction. And I always get nervous that description of me as expert on addiction is not mine. I don't like it. It makes me really nervous because sometimes I feel like I'm not even an expert on my own addiction. So I would just kind of like to bracket that. But when you publish a book, they have to figure out how to market you, and they thought that was a good way to do it. So I abjure that title. I deny it. So I am Peg, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm also a philosopher. Yay, hello. And for me, the two have gone hand in hand since I was a young undergraduate. So I started drinking young, as a just rising sophomore, I think, at St. Bernard's Central Catholic High School in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and then drank through high school and drank through college and sobered up afterwards. And I have always believed that my study of philosophy helped me to get and stay sober. And oftentimes when I say that to people, I'm met with a quizzical expression, like how could that possibly be? Because I think philosophy as an academic discipline, we've not done ourselves a lot of favor. I think actually we've lost touch with the roots of philosophy going back into ancient Greece, where the concern was the care for your soul or the care for your person or the care for your moral character. And even as a young person, that language spoke to me really clearly because it was so obvious to me that I didn't like who I was as a young person. I'm just smiling because I just saw my brother sit down. Hello, John O'Connor. Good to see you. And I knew that I wasn't being the kind of person that I wanted to be. Even if I didn't exactly know what I wanted to be, I knew what I didn't want to be. And I didn't want to be that person who was passing out behind grocery stores or hiding in a bathtub from the police raiding a party or getting dragged home, picked out of the bushes and brought back to my dorm room. I knew I didn't want to do that. But I also knew that I had tried to stop repeatedly. And Mark Twain is alleged to have said, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it thousands of times. And over the course of about a 9-year drinking period, I quit hundreds of times. And then I picked up hundreds of times plus one, but for the absolute last time. And so it wasn't until I was many years in recovery that it became clear to me that I needed to bring the part of me that's in recovery and the part that is a philosopher in conversation with each other because they hadn't been. And I was someone who didn't attend AA for about 19 years into my recovery when I realized I needed to do some things differently. And so I thought I might as well try AA again. I had tried it as a college sophomore, and I couldn't really even bring myself to sit in the meeting because I just wanted to bolt so quickly. So, there was a good long gap there. And sitting in AA meetings, I have come to see that we who struggle with addiction and recovery are some of the most philosophical people that I have ever met, and that we struggle with a lot of the central questions in philosophy. And it was one question in particular that really kind of made me smack my head and say, you big dummy, put these two things together. So I don't know if this is true for any of you, but it was true for me. And it was true of a woman who was really trying to be sober, and she still struggles. And she asked me, am I the same person now that I'm not drinking as I was when I was drinking? And I think we've all asked ourselves that. And that question about, in philosophy, we call it the continuity of personal identity over time. How is it that I am the same person I was when I was, let's say, 14 years old, as I was 24, as I was 44, as I'll soon be 58? What kind of ties us all together? And that's a philosophical question that has really intrigued philosophers and psychologists for quite some time. And one of the answers that this one philosopher, John Locke, so he was writing in the 1600s, John Locke argued that it's our memories that tie us together. Our memories are the ties that bind. And my friend and I had this really interesting discussion about, but what if you're a blackout drinker, which I most surely was, where days and weekends were gone? What if you're a blackout drinker and you don't have those memories? What ties you all together? What keeps you tethered to an identity, tethered to a set of relationships, or tethered to even a sense that you have moral worth? And it was in having this conversation where I thought, wow, philosophy as a discipline has so much to offer. And I feel like I have the good fortune to be a philosopher and to be a person in recovery, to try to make some of the central concepts in Western philosophy available to others who struggle in the way that I did, and who try to figure out, how do I make meaning and sense of addiction, and how do I make meaning and sense in recovery? So philosophy arguably is the oldest academic discipline. If you were to draw a family tree or a genealogy, philosophy was one of the original ones. And much later on, from natural philosophy comes biology and chemistry, and sociology and psychology come along in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So a lot of the disciplines that work on addiction now come from philosophy. And I don't say that to try to stake a claim that philosophy is the most important discipline. I certainly don't think that. Maybe not, maybe. But I think that philosophy has a lot to offer all of us who struggle with addiction, because many of the questions we ask really center on questions about making meaning and making sense, and how do we transform suffering? Because I think one of the easiest ways to describe addiction, it's a particular form of suffering, and that addiction can be both cause and consequence of suffering. So how do we make sense of that suffering? How do we make sense of what we do to ourselves? How do we make sense of maybe the ways we feel that opportunities have been foreclosed to us, or we zigged when we should have zagged, and now we find ourselves feeling as if we're completely lost? So my hope in bringing philosophy into many of the contemporary discussions about addiction is to what? Give people more ways to come to understand themselves. So one philosopher wrote, and I think it's fair to say that we live in a world in which scientific explanations are dominant about everything. So if you read around in addiction studies, there's a pretty clear set of refrains that have to do with addiction is a brain disease, addiction involves chronic relapsing, addiction is a consequence of brains having been hijacked in some kind of way. It's really quite evocative language. And so neuroscience and biology and chemistry and addiction medicine are important voices in these discussions. But one philosopher that I love very much, his name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was an Austrian philosopher who lived from about 1889 to 1952. He wrote that we feel that even if all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life still have not been touched. And so I think it's the colossal understatement of the universe to say that addiction is a problem in living. It's a problem of life. And scientific explanations can help us to understand ourselves to a certain degree, but it doesn't help us to understand the meaning or sense that we can make of ourselves as persons in the world in relationship with others, persons who have hope and aspirations, or people who have had hopes and aspirations just ground out of them in a kind of way. And so to think about addiction as a problem of life, that's a way of looking at humanity that is really the wheelhouse of philosophy. So one of the important ways that I understand addiction, am I going to say it's a chronic brain disease involving relapse? I think that gets something right. I think there's something right about that. Do I think it's got psychological roots? Sure, I do. Do I think that there's all kinds of biochemical tsunamis happening in different parts of the brain? Sure, I do. But for me, one of the best descriptions I ever heard of what addiction is and how I understood it comes from the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who lived in the early to midish 1800s. And he wrote that the greatest hazard of all, losing the self, can occur very quietly in the world as if it were nothing else. No other loss can occur so quietly. Any loss, he says, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, is sure to be noticed, but we don't notice losing ourself. And so the way I define addiction, it's one way to lose yourself. And so in thinking about what that might mean is, I think that's a really good description for people who develop addictions later on in life. And following some of the trends, what we're seeing is that older people are starting to develop more addictions. They're starting to have more problems with alcohol. And now in the United States, where more states have recreational marijuana that's been legalized, that there's this growing number of people who are, technically senior citizens, let's say moving into their 60s and 70s and even 80s, that because of all of the colossal changes in their lives, they lose parts of themselves. Perhaps they've had to retire. Perhaps they've lost a spouse. Perhaps their adult children have moved far away. Or, on the other hand, what we're also seeing is more grandparents are having to care for their own grandchildren because of all of the opiate and other drugs that are being abused, where you have many people who are in their 60s and 70s who are losing themselves in trying to meet the very real demands that they face from raising grandchildren or taking care of their adult children, or even those who have super elders. So someone who's in their 50s or 60s or even 70s who's still taking care of their own elderly parents. And so they lose themselves, and it becomes more comforting to have that extra glass of wine or to have a few more drinks out with people. And with elders, it turns out that we can develop addictions more quickly because our biology works against us. And so that sense of addiction is one way to lose yourself, I think makes a lot of sense for people who had full lives before and maybe had really stable identities, but they start to lose it because their lives change in all different kinds of ways. They change and how they're standing in relationship with other people. That makes sense to me. And I think too that younger people can lose themselves in a kind of way that can lead to addiction, because oftentimes when you're younger, you're busy trying on so many different ways of being. So I spend a lot of time with college students, and I see that they're both trying to separate from their parents, separate from their siblings, separating from the people at high school, and they're trying to figure out who they are, and they just try on so many different identities. And sometimes it's really fun and playful, and other times you start to see them latch on to alcohol or drugs. So you can lose yourself before you even have a fully established self. I think that's why young people are particularly susceptible to developing addiction. So they're losing a self that they never even fully had achieved yet or attained. And then I think there's a whole subset of examples of the other thing I work a lot on is trauma, and working on particular childhood trauma where you see the effects of kids who are subjected to kind of persistent forms of trauma are far more susceptible to developing addictions. And that a third to a half of kids who are severely traumatized, whether it's because of their immigration status, whether it's because of violence within the home, natural disasters, in the United States, school shootings, that you have so many kids who are so traumatized that they don't have the opportunities to cultivate the skills to kind of have a well-formed person, to have a well-formed sense of self. And so to think about, I think there's a whole subset of people who are addicted who never even had the chance to develop a stable sense of self. And that's a traumatic, morally troubling kind of loss. And so philosophy helps to give voice to those experiences of what does it mean to be a self? What does it mean to be a person who is a full moral agent? Or back it up even, what does it mean to even be a person? Because on the one hand, a person is a descriptive category. We can point to human beings and say person, 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 person. But on the other hand, it's a prescriptive, or what we call a normative category, that when we encounter people that I keep using the word people here, I don't want to use that word. When we encounter someone who is like us and we recognize their humanity, we recognize their personhood, we treat them in certain kinds of ways. That we don't treat a person the same way we would treat a pen. We don't treat a person in the same way that we would treat an inanimate object, because we'd say there's something wrong with that, because human beings, persons, are different in kind from other kinds of physical objects, and that human beings are entitled to a certain baseline level of respect and should be accorded a certain amount of dignity. And what happens when we have some large categories of individuals who aren't treated that kind of way? And so many of those people, to connect back to what I said about trauma, that I think many people are exposed to all different kinds of suffering and harms, and they become unable to see that they themselves have any self-worth. And they maybe become fatalistic in the sense people like me just don't deserve any better, or using alcohol or drugs is a legitimate form of escape from really horrible kinds of realities, or it's a way to feel connections. I mean, I think you talk to a lot of us, and we oftentimes remember our first drink or our first drug use, and we remember our last. And the experience we have in those early times. So for me as a kid who was very shy and always felt awkward and always felt like I didn't fit in some kinds of ways, when I drank, I became more social and outgoing. I could be livelier and funnier, and I felt like people liked me. I mean, it also helped that I started going gray in high school, so I could always go to the liquor store and buy without ever getting carded. So I did have a certain high level of popularity because of this hair, but I also felt like I was accepted in a kind of way. But the thing about alcohol and drugs that I think we all know is that it can, what do I want to say here? It can aid us in certain ways. It can maybe make us feel secure or more comfortable in a kind of way. But we all know that there's that tipping point, and that we drink or use to reach a certain level. But most of us then will drink or use far beyond that, where we end up, I always describe myself as kind of the maudlin type. When I'd get really drunk, it was like, woe is me, and it's all about me. And it was just awful in a kind of way. But it's in part because there were parts of myself that I absolutely hated. So when we think about what does it mean to be a person, what does it mean to be a self, that's a philosophical question. Because in philosophy, the self was originally thought about as, well, that's your soul. That's the immaterial part of you. That's the thing that you most truly or essentially are. And your body is this cage. It's something that imprisons you, but it's also that which distracts and misleads you in a kind of way. And there is always a picture that a self should be seamless, that it should have that kind of integrity of uniformity. And I don't think if any of us were to do a deep dive into what we see as ourself or what we see as our self identity, would say it is seamless in that kind of way. That there are all these different dimensions to us. The philosopher Montaigne, who was a French philosopher writing in the 1500s during the French Civil War when the Catholics were persecuting and killing the Protestants, Montaigne wrote about the ways in which we are all just these incredible bundles of inconsistencies. And some of these inconsistencies, they don't bother us at all, and they can be even kind of charming. But other kinds of inconsistencies can be utterly devastating, that they can really make us feel as if we were riven, as if we were really torn apart. And I know for me, I always felt like I had such a fractured self, that there was no wholeness or integrity to me in a kind of way, because I wanted things that I shouldn't have wanted. So in high school, I knew that I wasn't straight. I knew that I didn't like boys. I knew that I liked girls. And again, in St. Bernard Central Catholic High School, that was not a good thing to be. That was not a good thing to even contemplate. And that I was not the favorite of most of the nuns at the school. My brother was, but I was not. Yes, he was, because, well, I got terribly drunk at a school dance and insulted the nun's habit. You know, I was lippy and it came flying out of my mouth. And I remember among the many things that the nuns did to punish me, they were going to expel me, but then they decided they would give me an in-house suspension, where this was utterly diabolical. They made me sit by myself in the school library, and classes would come in and everyone would know, oh, that's Peg, she got caught drinking. And they did the same thing to me in the school cafeteria. I had to sit at my own table in the middle of all the other tables so that I was highly visible in my offense, highly miserable in my crime and misdemeanor by getting drunk at a school dance. And the one thing that was so true was that shame was always a mechanism for delivering the most harsh judgments. Others would deliver that judgment on me, but I internalized that so well that I didn't need the nuns to be telling me what a terrible person I was, what an embarrassment I was, what a disappointment I was, that I should get kicked off the National Honor Society. I mean, all these sorts of things. Nobody had to say that to me because I was saying that to myself all the time. And shame in philosophy has this really interesting history. There was a view of shame that shame is an immature emotion, that shame has it has a positive function in that we as young people internalize the worldviews and the judgments of people around us. I think we'd all grant that to good or bad effect. But Aristotle, this one philosopher, says we should feel shame in the actual or imagined gaze of those people whom we respect, whose opinion of us matters. That when we see we're not up to scratch, we're not up to snuff, shame can be a mechanism that prompts us to make positive change, to help us to become in alignment with the community standards so that we do come up, we are on par. And there's been a movement in psychology and in psychiatry to try to harness that power of shame to perform that particular function. And that's a move that really makes me nervous because, one, I think it would have to be an exceptional therapist who could wield that tool with surgical precision. Because I think for me, and I know for so many others I have talked about, that we who develop addictions, oftentimes we are steeped in shame. So if suffering is cause and consequence of addiction, shame is cause and consequence of addiction. And I don't tend to believe that something that can cause addiction can also cause us to make the changes to pull us out of addiction. And the thing about shame, what I find is that shame is very opportunistic. And maybe shame is like water. It's always going to flow down into the low spots. But that many of us who are addicted, we feel great shame about so much. So about the particular things we did, the particular relationships maybe that we trashed, the opportunities that we blew, the ways perhaps we completely debased ourselves, maybe the ways in which we didn't meet our own kind of moral assessment. And I think one of the earliest casualties in addiction is losing trust in yourself. And now sometimes we lose trust in ourselves because we never really had trust in the world to begin with. And that goes back to my earlier comments about, in particular, kids who are traumatized have learned not to trust the people around them, have learned not to trust the broader world. And losing self-trust is absolutely devastating, I think. So self-trust is an early casualty of addiction. And trust is a moral emotion. Trust is something that we have to learn how to feel, and we have to learn how to have it to the right degree and direct it in the appropriate way to the appropriate people. But what happens when a person comes to regard herself as thoroughly distrustful? It's devastating. And I think many of us, so I would make these deals with myself all the time. I'll only have 2 drinks. I never go into a bar during the light of day, although outdoor bars, I had to split a hair on that. I wouldn't go into places to eat that were really bars serving food. I mean, I had all these things that I was going to do so that I wouldn't drink beyond. I'd always stop drinking at 9 o'clock. I always did go beyond those things. And so I lost trust in myself, which made it really easy for me to believe that I was fundamentally an untrustworthy person. So that's why I say that shame and the way these things spread is opportunistic. So I also had no trust that I would ever be able to stop drinking because I had tried so often and I had failed just as many times. And that sense that I am someone who fails gets universalized or extended. I just don't fail about this thing. I don't just fail about that thing. I myself am a complete failure. And that addiction lends itself to these kinds of totalized ways of thinking about yourself and your worth and your place in the world. And I think that's where so many of us, we get stuck. Because at our absolute worst, and I would say I reached this point as a young person, as a sophomore in college, you become indifferent to yourself. And I think there's nothing more harmful or more devastating than being indifferent. So I know it's become a kind of casual phrase of, oh, I don't care. I don't care. That expression, I don't care, that has application that gets too broadly made. But when you don't genuinely care for yourself, you no longer see yourself as a full person. And that if you were to hear someone else talk about themselves in that kind of way, you would probably try to engage with them to say, no, 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 no. But we who are addicted oftentimes take ourselves to be unique in that we are so bad, so untrustworthy. And this is a wonderful problem in philosophy, is to ask, what is self-knowledge? How does each of us know him, her, or themselves? And the dominant picture in philosophy, it comes from this French philosopher, René Descartes, in the early 1600s. It's where the Enlightenment philosophy comes from. But he really believed that each of us could, in effect, turn a big flashlight into our minds. And he waffled between soul and mind, but we're not going to split that hair. But that there would be nothing that could be hidden from our view, from the light of reason. All could be revealed. And I think that's just false. And you have other philosophers and psychologists. William James is one of them. William James, who had the huge effect on the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was William James, among others, who brought us the concept of the subconscious, that sure, we've got a rational conscious mind that has kind of a guard dog property to it. It's always patrolling the perimeter to make sure that there are no incursions from the sub or the unconscious self. And so to think, though, that I can know myself better than anyone else because I can always see everything in me, on the one hand, that's really plausible because no one else can tell what we're thinking most of the times, right? We can have poker faces, we can say one thing and mean a different thing, but we really know what we mean. So we have this picture of self-knowledge that nobody can know the real me. And when we're addicted, it's oftentimes nobody can know the real me and know all the terrible things that I have done. But what we don't see is that self-knowledge is very much a product of how other people see us and engage with us. We can learn so much from how other people see us and engage with us. And this is one of the things I love about AA and other self-help groups, is that each of us learns about him, her, or themselves by being able to see themselves in the stories of others, or to listen to someone who maybe was worse off than I was, and look, that person can do it, and they've got some of the same traits I do. So self-knowledge is very much of a social production that comes from being in relationships with all different kinds of other people. And it's a challenge, though, I think, for many of us to believe that other people can have a better perspective on us than we have on our own selves. And I put an asterisk on that claim because I'm also aware of the ways in which many of us who have perhaps, talking to a lot of people about this, who have been through the medical system for their treatment, feel as if they're objectified in a kind of way. That we who suffer from addictions, we can't be reliable reporters on our own experiences with addiction, why we drink or use, or how or why, or what might work for us. And we are. So it's this delicate balance of recognizing the right others who can help us to achieve self-knowledge without giving absolutely everyone else authority over how it is that we see or understand ourselves. And that achievement, self-knowledge, is an achievement. And I think it's an achievement that is important in recovery, especially in early recovery, but also in later recovery, because we're constantly changing. So to go back to that early question, what is a self? A self isn't a something. Your identity is not like a rock solid block that other things just might attach to, but we're always selving. We're always in process. We're always changing and developing and responding because we are always in environments and in conditions with other people and other animals and with the physical world. So to think about the fact that all of us are always changing and developing, that we could be otherwise, that nothing is set in stone, can be incredibly liberating, or it can be horrifying. So the philosopher Nietzsche, among others, says something along the following lines, that freedom is absolutely horrifying. And I think we discover this in recovery in certain kinds of ways, that freedom can be horrifying, and that there are different times in our lives when that freedom is revealed to us and we're terrified by it. So Nietzsche and another philosopher, Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, talk about the ways in which, well, it was Kierkegaard who says, it isn't so much that we're afraid that we'll fall into the abyss, but rather that we'll jump. And so maybe a more, maybe many of us aren't standing around on the edge of an abyss, but when you're driving your car and you're driving and you realize I'm going 60 miles per hour, and with a quick turn to my right or a turn to my left, I could really do something that would be utterly devastating. I have a friend who said, I can never go on a boat. I could never go on a big cruise in the middle of the ocean and be outside because I'm afraid I will jump. I don't want to kill myself, but I'm just afraid. I stand on that edge and I realize I could jump if I chose to. That's horrifying in a kind of way, but it's also, it reveals something important, that we always have some amount of choice in what we do and in how we do it. And while our choices can be constrained in all different kinds of ways, we always have a choice about how we respond to situations, what our attitudes are towards something, including what our attitudes are towards our own self. So freedom can be horrifying, and the flip side of freedom is responsibility. So here we come again, back to that notion of person. If I don't see that I am worthy, that I am not a person, that I am just no better off than some physical object in the world, I really don't have a care for what will happen for me. And I won't see that maybe I could do some things differently. I become a fatalist, or I become a nihilist, that nothing really matters at all. I don't care. I'm indifferent to myself. But when we begin to see that just maybe something could be different, it's a possibility that I might be able to do something differently, and we become willing to act on that. That's one definition of faith that comes from the American philosopher William James, who had that profound effect on Bill Wilson. So in thinking about faith, faith doesn't require a God. Faith doesn't require any set of dogma or doctrine. Faith is just a willingness to live on possibility or a maybe. It's a willingness to believe before the results can be certified. The results can't be guaranteed. So what William James says is that your belief in something can help make something become true or become actual, which I think is a really potent way to think about when we, by whatever means, came to make a choice about how to live life differently and not have alcohol and drugs at the center of our access or at the core of our being or everything that we oriented around. That had to be accompanied with the willingness to try to do something differently, even though maybe in the past you have not succeeded. But in that willingness, that's where the freedom is. And in that freedom, we are able to maybe live more fully, live more connectedly to others, to live in ways that we couldn't possibly ever have imagined. Because one of the things that addiction does, in addition to all the other things, is it makes it really hard for some of us to imagine good things for us. We might say, I'm the kind of person who doesn't deserve it, or I can't imagine. My imagination only runs in one direction, and that's from bad to worse. So even being willing to imagine, which is a basic human function, to be able to imagine that my life could be different, can be life altering. To see that there are other possibilities for me, that things don't have to be this way. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts in recovery, is that we come to see that while there's so much we can't control, we can always control our attitudes, and we can always put the best effort in trying to live well. And that it is an incredible joy and privilege to think about what a good life looks like. And at the end of the day, philosophy has always been asking questions about what a good life is. And being in recovery, we get to ask that question, and we get to look at all these different ways to answer it. So I'm going to end there. And I would love to hear sort of how you all think of good life, because I like to think that any of us who is in this meeting does have a pretty good life. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And I'm grateful for spending time with you today. And I'm grateful for your patience in listening to me. So thank you. Thank you.